Okay, so now the session has started, as far as I understand. Welcome to this session. This is session 5, towards carbon neutrality, mobility and energy independence in the EU. I am Fulvio Fontini, I'll be your chair, but the real important ones are the speakers, so I will immediately move to the first speaker of the session, Marco Cabano from CESI in Italy, who will present us a paper on impact of e-mobility on distribution system, the role of smart tariff for vehicle grid integration. Remember, you have 20 minutes, and then we have some time for question and answer. The floor is yours, Marco. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen. Just to share with you the slide I prepared to describe the analysis we did about e-mobility and the impact of e-mobility in distribution system. In particular, we will focus and we will give you also some key takeaways about the importance of smart tariffs on vehicle grid integration. First of all, why electric mobility is important and will be much more important in the next years? Well, as we can see in this slide, the transport sector has a very relevant share of the total greenhouse gases emissions. And of course, we need to face this greenhouse gases emission with the technologies we have, and the most mature one is, of course, electric mobility that is going to be developed. In this slide, we see more in detail some figures that show us that the various sectors have different behavior in the last year. So we have some sector that was very, with very relevant reduction of emission in the last years. Transport sector is a sector that do not respond in the last years to the need of reduction of greenhouse gases emission. So what the Fit for 55 did in the last years was to set some goals dedicated to the transport sector, and we have set in Europe a goal of zero emission from cars and vans by 2035. So a very ambitious goal in a very short time. So basically, we have seen that electrification of mobility is very important in the next year. That's the reason because we did this analysis and we developed a methodology in order to investigate how tariffs can help mitigate this huge investment that are needed in the distribution grids. And we also want to quantify the benefit of this tariff. And to do this, we need to consider three main families of factors. We need to model the demand of electric vehicles. We need to know very well the grid structure in the country or in the DSO that we are going to analyze. And we need to know also the tariff structure of the country, that we are all bill payers, let's say, so we know that also tariffs are very complex in their framework. How we did in our analysis, and we will present the results on a case study in the next slides, but I want to give you a framework of a very high-level description of the framework of the methodology we developed to do this assessment. We developed two different models, one for the forecast of electric vehicle demand and one for estimating the investment in the distribution grid. The inputs of the model for the demand forecast has been the tariffs, flat or time of use, for measure the impact of the difference of the tariffs. the number of electric vehicles, of course, and also many model parameters that I will show in detail in the next slide, like the charging point, the feature, the charging behavior of the people, the use of the vehicle, and so on. The output of this first model is the EV electricity demand profile, which is an input, of course, of the investment needed in the distribution grid, together with also other inputs like the peak loads that now we have in the distribution grid we need to analyze, and also the load profile of the network components. We need to know also how the conventional load, so all the load except for electric vehicles, will grow in the next years. And we need to know, of course, the cost of replacing the components that need to be replaced because of the increase of load. The output is the additional investment due to the demand for electric vehicles. So it's a very complex topic, the forecast of electricity demand by electric vehicles. The first thing we have to model, of course, is the vehicle type. We need to know for each type of vehicle which is the consumption, the battery size, and many other characteristics, and also for the different type of vehicles, which can be car, motorcycle, taxis, buses, and so on. We need to know the charging points, if they are unmanaged, if they are vehicle on grid, vehicle to grid, so the possibility to shift the consumption during the day or not. We need to know their installed capacity, of course, if we are talking about 3 kilowatts, 7 kilowatts, 22 kilowatts charging station. We need to know the charging behavior of who owns the vehicle. So every type of user has a different behavior. Of course, a taxi has a different behavior of a commuter or of a bus, and so on. We need to know the vehicle use, so how many kilometers, the distance traveled during the year, that is related to the consumption. We need to know how many vehicles we have in the country or in the DSO, the distribution system operated perimeter. And we need to know the feature also of the charging places, because commuters will charge in part at home, in part at work, with different charging points, with different charging installed capacity or rated power. So we need to model all this topic together, and this is a very complex, but we developed a very detailed modeling of this. What we did about time of use tariff to measure the impact of time of use tariff? Time of use tariff are tariffs which are different during the day. So we did an iterated process in order to define which tariff for the specific context that I'm going to describe in the next slides, which is the best tariff that minimizes the costs for development of the distribution grid. And in this specific context was a 2-period tariff with a low tariff period between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. and a high tariff period in the remaining part of the day. Which was this context? Because this disclaimer is very important, because of course, I want to give you in the next slide some figures about the findings of our study, but the important thing is that the results are very, very related to the context. So I want to show you the results related to this context, because are useful to understand the main behavior, let's say, the main figures, but of course, for different contexts, we need to develop specific studies with specific inputs, maybe with the same methodology, but with dedicated inputs. So the results that I'm going to present was related to a country, a DSO in South America, in the year 2035, and with 2 different scenarios of evolution of EV uptake. So the 13% of EV uptake and the 26% of EV uptake. And we consider this type of vehicle, which are the most probable to be interested by electrification in the next years. These are the key results for the conservative scenario. So the scenario with the 13%, with the lower amount of electric vehicle. In the left side of the slides here, we see two figures for the flat tariff and for the time of use tariff. The blue lines are related to the conventional load, so the load without electric vehicles, and the green line is the load with the electric vehicle. The numbers are expressed as a percentage, where 100% is the peak load of the load without electric vehicles. So the blue line has a peak of 100%, putting with a flat tariff, the 13% of electric vehicles, the peak is in another hour in the year, in the day, and is 8% higher than the peak without electric vehicles. With time of use tariff, in this specific context, we have a peak of only 4% more than the peak without electric vehicles. So only introducing the time of use I described before, we reduce the peak of 4% of the peak. The figures on the right are only the difference between the two curves, because we have the curve of EV demand. With a flat tariff, people comes home and or at work and has the target of charging the vehicle as soon as possible without incentive to postpone the charge. With a time of use, we have seen that we have lower prices during the night, so we have the shift of a part of the energy through the night, starting from instead of charging during the day. And this is what caused the reduction of the peak. Here are the key results in terms of economics, let's say. If we have 100% of investments in with a flat tariff in the specific context we modeled, the 16% of this investment is due to the electric vehicle. The 84% is due to only load. Let's say we need to develop the network even without electric vehicle, of course. With a time of use tariff, we can have an overall reduction of 13% of the cost of investment in the distribution grid. And we can have, of course, the most of reduction are on the electric vehicle component, because the assumption of our studies that the, let's say, the other demand, the other load is inelastic compared to the tariffs. But this is a relevant reduction of cost, just introducing a new tariff. Here in the right, we see just a few details about which kind of equipment, which kind of components of the network, of the grid, need to be replaced in the two cases, flat and time of use tariff. So we have more than 7% of HV transformer and 6% of low and medium voltage equipment. And we see that the time of use, in particular for the low voltage and medium voltage equipment, allow, let's say, almost to avoid additional investments in the grid. We did the same analysis also for the ambitious scenario, so with more vehicles. Now, I don't want to repeat and spend a lot of time. Of course, if you have questions, we can go deep in detail. But in this case, of course, the increase of the peak is higher because we have more electric vehicles. With a flat tariff, we have an increase of 15%. With a time of use tariff, we have an increase of only 7%. And in terms of investments, we have these figures, so an increased reduction thanks to the time of use tariff, What we can see from this slide is that, of course, the behavior is not linear with the increase, because we have the double of the vehicles, but not all the numbers doubled, because, of course, the behavior is very non-linear. So we need to repeat another analysis with the different assumption of electric vehicles. So just to go to the conclusion, we have, of course, highlighted the importance of the decarbonization in the transport sector. To do this, we have to, more important, this goal has many implications. Most of them are related to the development of the charging points and refueling station, also to the development of renewables dedicated to the production of this electricity that will feed the electric vehicles. We need to improve the transmission and distribution infrastructure, but I hope that with my presentation, I also emphasize the importance of the role of appropriate tariff schemes to mitigate the investments in the distribution grid. Of course, we need modeling, which are complex, and we need also a lot of data about the distribution grid to do very sound and reliable studies about these topics. So I give the floor back to the other participant to this discussion, and of course, if you have questions, you can just write in the chat or just ask, also contact me, let's say, later. So thank you very much.
Marco, thank you very much. Excellent time management. And I agree. Let's see if there is any question from the floor. I can't see much effectively in the chat, but I don't see any question. It seems there is. Oops, what happened? So can you see? Yeah, I'm still here. So I see that there is no question from the floor, and hope you can still hear me. Okay, so maybe I could add a question, but you know, it's the standard question. In this case, is there what do you see after the study? I mean, what's the follow-up of this?
Well, the follow-up, in my opinion, is to continue to update, to collect as much information as possible from the distribution grid operator, because we are, let's say, the results of the study highlighted a very important impact of tariffs. In Europe, or even in a country like Italy, we are talking about of billions of savings potentially in structuring well a time of use tariff scheme. So in my opinion, we have to keep study the topic, to collect the most reliable data from the current use of the distribution grid, the assets that are already in place, and to do study with different uptake of expectation in the next years, in order to be prepared in advance, because tariff topics and distribution grid development are topics that need years to be developed and implemented.
You see, maybe I can further add on this, because you know that tariff have also a very important distributional effect in an economic sense. Now we are in a world that have seen, you know, the boost of electricity prices and the response of regulation to maybe not the best response, or not the most direct one, but to tackle distributional effect affecting tariffs. So it's an indirect way to influence distributional problems or a problem of wealth through tariff. So in this regard, what about possible future impact of these on the evolution of the sector that you have just studied?
Well, what I described before was, let's say, independent from, let's say, consideration about the redistribution and, let's say, overtaxation on the tariff. What is important to highlight is that just introducing, because let's say a time of use tariff do not means an increase of tariff. It just means that the tariff have these different values in different hours of the day. So the total money paid by the bill payers can be the same with a time of use tariff or with a flat tariff. The important thing is to give the possibility to give signals to the demand, the price signal, the right price signal that allow for an efficient development of the grid. Because if for someone it doesn't make difference to charge the vehicle in the evening or in the night. If you give to these people the possibility to shift their charge to the night, it can save a lot of money for all, because we don't need to develop further the distribution grid. So this is the impact, in my opinion, that has to be considered and taken into consideration for the regulators, basically.
So thank you very much for your answer. I see that there is no question that has emerged from the chat, no question from other speakers. So if you don't have anything else to add, I would thank you for your presentation and for the reply. And I would move to the second presenter, who is Franco Del Manzo from Milien in Italy. And Franco, the floor is yours. Thank you again for your presentation.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone. This is my presentation. I hope it is seen very well. Okay.
Yes, maybe if you prefer, you can put it in presentation mode, but otherwise you can stay this way.
Okay.
Excellent, perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. UNEM is my association, and UNEM represents the fuels producers in Italy and also energy producers for mobility. So not only fossil fuels, but also biofuels, also synthetic fuels, and every form of energy that can give a contribution to the decarbonization of the economy, in particular decarbonization of transports. And let me start with three questions, because we have a big challenge. We have seen in the previous presentation that transport is the most difficult sector to be decarbonized. So my question is possible to decarbonize the road transport sector quickly? Do we really decarbonize the transport sector by limiting tailpipe CO2 emissions only, in particular only at the tailpipe of cars and heavy-duty vehicles? And then we have also a problem for aviation and maritime and decarbonization. Okay, the answer to this question, in our opinion, is no, is not possible with the current European legislation. And we think that this legislation disregards a lot of low carbon solution that can give a good contribution for this transportation. And so this is the reason why we try to develop synthetic fuels in order to reach this target for transport. The European legislation narrative is that de-electrification is the only technologies to decarbonize the transport, and this disregard the other solution, betray the principle of technological neutrality, and do not allow the decarbonization of the sector. So we need other fuels. We need other fuels because the transport sector in Europe is represented by 300 million passenger cars, of which only 4 million are battery electric vehicles. And you know immediately that to replace this car park, does it take 20, 30 years, during which if we do not develop other form of carbon neutral fuels, we are obliged to continue to use fossil fuels and we don't reach any reduction in CO2 in this. So this is the most important point of this presentation, because with the legislation has been planned and implemented by European Commission, we do not meet the target of the decarbonization. On the contrary, this kind of legislation is leading to European used car market very expanding, a growing average of EU car fleets, a total loss of European automotive industry competitiveness versus the countries that is well advanced in electric vehicle components like China and so on. So our proposal is to modify the legislation in order to allow the use of carbon neutral fuels, not to totally substitute the electrification, but to complement the electrification. We are well aware that the electrification is developing also very fast in some countries, in particular very rich countries. If you see the eastern part of Europe, the electrification is near zero. But anyway, we don't avoid that the electrification is increasing in some way. We ask to have the possibility to implement other solution in order to reach the common target of decarbonization. And the fuels are our proposal, because these fuels can reduce immediately the greenhouse gases of all park fleet currently used in Europe, in order to improve also the situation of electric grid. E-fuels can accumulate large quantities of non-programmable renewable electricity. Moreover, these fuels are completely compatible with the current fuels and do not need any change in the infrastructure without any adaptation. So we can use the depots, we can use the service station, we can use the same logistic structure that we have now in force. And then with the development of the fuels, we can also decarbonize aviation and maritime that is not possible to electrify. And but if we don't start with the possibility to use e-fuels in the road transportation, e-fuels will never develop. Because we don't reach the scale economy and we don't have the possibility to decarbonize aviation and maritime. So for this reason, we have developed research on this area in cooperation with Innovab and Politecnico di Milano. Innovab is a lab very well introduced in the research in the automotive, and Politecnico is a well-known university. So we have developed this plant in order to produce some quantities of fuels to demonstrate the effectiveness of these fuels, and to make also some road experience directly with cars. And so this is the first step to have a plant, and Politecnico di Milano assessed all the technical and economical potential of this plant. We have, okay, in this slide, a short description of the plant. In particular, we use electrolysis technologies at low temperature, and then this is the process that we have used to develop this plant, and all the technical aspects are available for people who are interested in this kind of research. The size of the plant is to produce 8 barrels a day of syn crude in order to have an availability of product for our research and for demonstration at real life experiments. This plant has been developed also to implement the evolution of the refining industry. In our opinion, the refining industry that now is totally devoted to the production of fossil fuels from oil can be and need to be evolved in order to decarbonize all the process and to decarbonize all the products. And the e-fuel plant is one of a very good example to obtain this evolution, because the refining system already has started to use some other raw material like biomass, like CO2, like hydrogen and green hydrogen, and so on. And so waste in particular. For the future, we can develop a process that can substitute totally the oil with these renewable sources, and to produce carbon neutral fuels. In this chart, we can see how can we produce different product for different raw material from oil. And with also CCS and CCU plant, we can eliminate any CO2 emission from the process, and so to produce really carbon neutral fuel and raw material also for petrochemical. But all this is impossible if the current CO2 regulation do not change. We are not against the target that has been fixed by the Commission, and we have seen also in the previous presentation, transport sector need to reduce the CO2 in cars from 55% in 2030 and 100% in 2035. But is impossible to meet this target with this kind of regulation that measures the emission only at the tailpipe, so with the tank-to-wheel approach. This is an approach totally wrong in our opinion, because do not take into account the CO2 emitted during the production of the fuels or the production of the energy vector that is used. And so the result is that if you have only zero at the tailpipe, you have not obtained a total reduction of the CO2. So this is the main aspect to be changed, because if we really want to eliminate all the CO2 in the transport, we have to eliminate also the CO2 that is produced before the use of the car. We hope that this can be obtained or can be resulted from the discussion that we have with the institution, both at national and at European level, and to have recognized that a car that using a totally carbon neutral fuel can be defined as a zero emission vehicle, exactly in the same way that is defined a zero emission vehicle, a battery electric vehicle, but only when the electricity is totally renewable. Because today a battery electric vehicle is defined strongly zero emission vehicles, because it's not a zero emission vehicle, it's a vehicle that emits a lot of CO2 for production of the batteries and for production of the electricity. So this is the proposal that we are discussing with the authorities at national and international level. We want to be part of the decarbonization process of the transport. We are able to deploy all the expertise that our industries has accumulated in 40 years. We can assure the availability of carbon neutral fuels, both for road and other sector of transport. But all this will be possible only if the legislation will allow this availability that we have. Because if the legislation block from the start the development, we cannot produce this kind of fuel, and okay, this could be important only for us, but most important, the target of the decarbonization will not meet in the time that the European Commission has been established. Okay, this is my presentation. I give you back the floor and able to answer any question.
Thank you, Franco. Thank you for your presentation. Again, I would like to ask the floor if there is any question. which I don't see. So let me ask you a question. I haven't seen the paper, so please correct me if I'm not correct. The plan that you have just presented, it's a study, right? It is not being constructed, but have you, or is there any project to implement it, for instance, at a pilot phase to test it? Or what's the stage of development?
Yes. As you can see, can know, the fuel development is at an early stage of technologies. There are a few plants around the world that is producing a few quantity of e-fuels. This project is at the starting point. We have a connection with some refineries in Italy in order to evaluate the best logistic place in order to realize a demonstration plant. We are also searching for funding resource in order to produce this plant. But okay, first of all, we need to have results of these activities with the Politecnico that can give us all the parameters that we need in order to have availability of renewable electricity, availability of CO2. Okay, in this case, we can use the CO2 recovered from, for example, a plant in refineries. But in the future, the CO2 can be also produced from atmosphere if we have enough energy to do this. And so the location of the plant will be in one refineries when we have solved all this problem. It's important to have this plant as soon as possible, because we need to demonstrate that we are able to propose an alternative to the total electrification of the transport.
Thank you for your answer. If I might add a comment which was coming to my mind while you were answering, but which of course has no answer now. There is always a kind of a vicious circle between regulation and technical and economic developments, because as you have commented, without the proper regulation, there will not be the prerequisite to develop or to implement economically or in an economic efficient way a project. But at the same time, without the development of projects, there will not be the input or the stance, so you will not be able to show or communicate enough the possibility, the economic and technical possibilities that justify the change of regulation. So there is always an egg chicken game in which you never know which one comes first, and that of course we cannot solve right now, but it seems to me it's crucial in this case.
Absolutely correct. Yes, absolutely correct. We are trying to demonstrate that with the current legislation, it's really impossible to reach the target that the Commission has established. For example, for Italy, the scenario at 2030, in order to meet the Fit for 55 target, require 8 million of battery electric vehicles in 2030. This is the minimum in order to meet the Fit for 55 target. And we are a car registration of around 30,000 per year. How can we reach 8 million cars in 2030? Is really impossible. And if you don't take into account this consideration, okay, then it's impossible to go ahead. And industry is forced to make a decision on the basis of the legislation. Let's see what the car manufacturers are doing. They are investing billion and billion of euro in order to meet the current legislation. That is the legislation that imposes a very stringent limit on CO2. And this limit can be reached only with the implementation of battery electric vehicles, even if it's very, very difficult to implement this car. But the car manufacturers are totally devoted to battery electric vehicles because this is the only possibility to meet the future legislation.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I agree with you. Now, I don't see any other question that has appeared. Therefore, I would thank you again, and I would give the floor to the third speaker, Milien Dhorne, right, of Université Paris Nanterre. He asks us an interesting question: if new storage and renewables can push fossil fuels out in Europe. Now, that's the question. Let's see from your presentation if you give us also the answer.
Thank you very much. So let me put full screen here. So yeah, the question I've been trying to answer with Professor Marc Baudry at Université Paris Nanterre is the following one: can you storage and renewables push fossil fuels out? And by out we mean out of the market, the electricity market in Europe. So about the outline, it's very classic, so I won't spend that much time on this. So let's just present a few elements of context first. So we have two main objectives long-term in Europe for the power system. First, we need to reach net zero by 2050, and there's still some work to do. And second, we kind of witness it was difficult to deal with our fossil dependence with the current crisis and the current war in Ukraine. And we need to lower our exposure to geopolitical risks. So how to do that and to tackle these two questions at the same time? It's probably by trying to substitute coal and gas in the power system in Europe. And for that, so some countries could go for nuclear, but this is not a part of our presentation. So I'll focus more on viable renewable energies, VRE. But the problem is that they are intermittent, as you know, and they need backup. And some interesting studies by York showed that over the past 50 years, each unit of viable renewable energy only replaced 1/10 of a fossil unit, which is not a lot. So there is a need for something else as a flexible asset. And this asset could be energy storage. And they're becoming more interesting recently, because we've witnessed on the European markets that volatility increased, which is good because it means good for storage, at least, because it means they're becoming more profitable by just arbitraging prices. We also have witnessed some strong dynamics supported by the automotive sector that resulted in a drop on of 90% of 90% over the 10 last years, for example, for the battery pack. So it's a massive cost reduction that makes it more interesting, and we have to look into that from an energy economics point of view. So what do we know? Because storage economics is not really new. It has been here for a long time. What do we know about energy storage? Basically, we know that storage increases value of viable renewable energy. We have a lot of results on that, but it's mainly at the firm level and not the market equilibrium. It's not a market equilibrium approach. We also know that storage can capture different revenues from different markets, so they are very versatile, and they need to be active on different types of revenue streams. And finally, that the market design and imperfect competition is a huge driver for the appearance or the profitability of storage. So these are the results we know. What we do not really know, though, is what is the storage development potential. We have a few studies that are not completely satisfying. And in particular, we have a lot of studies dealing with the European power sector with 100% renewables. So we just have a snapshot in 2050, and we don't have the transition towards that, taking into account the fact that we stand in a situation where we rely on a lot of fossil fuels, and this could prevent or delay the appearance of renewables and storage. And more recently, we had an interesting branch of the literature that just shows it was not sure that storage, energy storage, electricity storage could help us reduce CO2 emissions. And the thing is that we will build on this new branch by Lin and Shi and Bisline and Huang, trying to evaluate to what extent storage associated with renewables can help us or not reduce CO2 emissions and our dependence to fossil fuels. So basically, our contribution is to account for the current European system and its transition. We will make or build a framework that makes competition between storage and new fossil power plants, and we will evaluate different policies and long-term, and we develop a long-term equilibrium and stochastic framework to do that. But let's start first with an introductory stylized model, so that you get some insights about what's happening and why storage could help or not, could help us or not to reduce some the emissions on the market. So it's a very simple model that is building on Lin and Shi, and basically we just improved it a little bit, and we have two periods in this model. We have an off-peak period and a peak period. So the off-peak period is a low price period, and the peak period is a high price period. And basically what we say here is that solar is going to produce only in off-peak period, which is usually the case in Europe. We have the morning and the evening peak where solar is not really producing a lot. But for wind, we could have, given a probability P wind, it could be possible that wind is producing on both periods with the same probability. So again, it is interesting to see what happens when storage enters the market. So here, what is going to happen is that storage is going to apply a very simple rule to buy low and to sell high. So it's going to buy in the first period where the prices are low and increase demand by quantity QS that I'll try to define later. But it's just we introduce this quantity for now. And the idea is that it's going to push up the demand in the first period and increase the load factor of base load technology, which is called A in this case, and it increases the price. And by selling at the second period, it will decrease the price and reducing the production of a technology B, which is the peaking technology. But the magnitude of the decrease is lower because we have a round trip efficiency. Storage is imperfect and the round trip efficiency is not 100%. So by charging and discharging, it is losing a part of the electricity. So what is interesting to see here is the first effect of why storage could increase CO2 emissions is because storage is overall a net power consumer because of this round trip efficiency. So you will need more power, and this could lead to higher emissions because you need to produce it from fossil fuels. So this is the first effect. The second effect that is interesting is that we increase the load factor of technology A and decrease it for technology B. But if technology A is more carbon intensive, then you increase the CO2 emissions. And the idea was to correct this by using a CO2 price to internalize the price of the damages to the environment. But with the current situation, with a very high gas price, then we have generally in Germany, for example, the coal producers being the baseload producing, as baseload technologies, and we're just replacing gas by coal. So it could increase the CO2 emissions. So this is the dispatch effect, and the second reason why storage could increase emissions. And the third effect that we will integrate in this study, and that is not really done in the literature, is basically it changes the price structure by increasing the price and lowering the high prices. It changes the price structure, and therefore it will long-term influence the investments. So we have to look at the investment effect. So just with this simple framework, if we derive some short-term impacts, what we can see is that the impact on CO2 emission, depending on the quantity of storage that we have introduced, it's difficult to determine the sign. It could be positive or negative. So or short term, it could increase or decrease CO2 emissions. What is sure, though, is that it helps solar by increasing the revenues of solar. It's always positive because basically what it does, it increases the price when solar is producing, so solar is better off. What happens for wind now? Well, for wind is not sure because you have a price increase and a price decrease, which depends on the slope that we have introduced here, and also depends on the round trip efficiency. So the magnitude is unclear again, and we cannot really conclude about the sign of this equation at the bottom here on the revenues of wind. So it depends on the shape of the supply curve. Is the supply curve is it concave? Then it's beneficial probably for wind. But if it's convex, then the price decrease in the second period is greater than the price increase, and wind is not better off, is losing money from the presence of storage. This was for the short-term impacts. We look now at the long-term impacts, taking into account new investments. And if we allow new investment on viable renewable energy, what happens is that we can see it helps solar to develop. And again, for wind is not really clear. Don't look too much at the expression there, but just bear with me on that. It's impossible to determine the sign, which depends on the shape factor, so the concavity index, and also the probability for wind and solar to produce. And if we look now in a framework where we allow new baseload, basically technology A capacities to enter the market, well, we still have an effect where solar is going to help. Storage is going to help solar, but we'll lose the effect for wind. So basically, whenever there is a dispatchable fossil fuel powered technology, well, the effects for storage on wind is limited. So this is basically what we'll try to find back in our next model. But just to conclude about that on the CO2 emissions, because that's what is interesting us, is that there exists a concavity index. So there is a shape of the supply curve for which storage helps to reduce emissions. You don't have to understand the conditions here, but basically the drivers of emission reduction are the presence of a low carbon baseload technology or high solar potential. And overall, the investment effects are ambiguous. So we will derive now a numerical model for the European energy transition just to confirm or nuance these results. So basically, it's a cost minimization program over 10 countries, which are represented on this map. As you can see, it's Western Europe. What is exogenous and fixed in this model is the demand that is based on historic data and also the current power mix. And we will introduce a growing number of electric vehicles and see how it changes the dispatch and the emissions. And we have also taken into account the increase of interconnections, which are based on some predictions by the TYNDP document, for example. What is endogenous in this model is the variable renewable energy capacities, the vehicle to grid, which is basically the conversion of some electric vehicles into fully revertible storage units, and other types of technologies. And in some cases, we also allow for new gas power plants, which is CCGT in this case, to enter the market. Very quickly about the data, I've been using very famous databases, Renewable Ninjas, the transparency platform, and things like that. So we've been developing a stochastic approach using scenarios, and we are looking at the long-term equilibrium, which is basically linear optimization. So this is just the way we've been building scenarios. It's a Monte Carlo approach. We've been sampling into some historic data on this variable, so solar, wind, and offshore and onshore wind production, the load, the nuclear availability in some countries, and the water inflows. And we get some weekly scenarios. We've got 600 weekly scenarios, and we minimize the cost over all these scenarios. So it's a bit more robust than if we use just a simple year, for example. And this is basically the program. And this problem is solved in 2 policy cases, and this is important now. So first, we allow for new gas CCGT to replace what we're going to phase out as a coal capacities. So basically, we make a shock, which is phasing out coal capacities by 2040, and we allow to replace it either by new gas and storage or just storage. In the second case, we do not allow for new gas to enter the market. And if we look at the results, we can see that the 2 cases, the first case is green. So it's with new gas being allowed, that what we phase out in red as coal capacities is entirely replaced first by gas. So there's nothing that goes for storage. Everything is just, the flexibility comes from new gas assets. And at some point in 2030, there is an coupling of the coal phasing out curve and the gas installations, because we increase the capacity of storage, and basically it's vehicle to grid mainly. Now, if we do not allow for new gas to enter the market, what happens is that it is the blue curves this time. We have more storage earlier and in a steadier increase, first with vehicle to grid, and then with batteries and a little bit of power to hydrogen. If we look at the CO2 emissions now in both cases, what is interesting is to see that if we allow for new gas, it's better, environmentally better. We save almost 1 year of emission towards 2040, but at the end of the period, it is emitting less emissions to rely only on storage and not use new gas power plants. And this is easily understood if you look at the fossil fuel consumption. The fact of using new gas or allowing new gas to enter the market helps us to reduce the coal consumption much quicker, which leads to lower emissions, but it maintains the consumption of gas very high, whereas we have a reduction of our energy dependence towards gas if we go for storage. So basically, I won't show the national metrics because I have not time, but just to make a link and to loop on our theoretical model here, I'll show you what are the impacts on the installation of new variable renewable energy capacities. So here are displayed the 3 technologies: solar at the top, onshore in the middle, and offshore at the bottom. And we've been allowing upper bound and lower bound. So it's just the corridor in which the capacities can develop. And basically what we see is that the solid line, which is the case without new gas, is increasing earlier and faster the penetration of renewables. And in particular for solar, which is very understandable as it is highlighted by the theoretical model, but also for offshore wind. And what is interesting is that we don't have very much difference between both cases for onshore wind this time. So overall, if we conclude about this study, is that we use the stochastic long-term equilibrium model to evaluate the impacts on the European markets of storage. And we find evidence that without a strong public support scheme, which is either higher renewable energy shares or coal phasing out or freeze gas investments, there's no room for storage. Storage will not massively enter the energy-only market, which is expected in the literature. We also find that the effect of storage on fossil fuels is limited. New gas benefits overall from a competitive advantage, and existing gas is still required. So if we allow for new gas, it will be more economic and more interesting to go for this technology. What is interesting, though, is that variable renewable energy mutually develop with storage systems, as we have demonstrated, which is not the case when you use new gas. So long term, it's not necessarily a good idea to go for gas, but short term and medium term, that would be a good idea. So it has many policy implications to restrict new gas facilities through, for example, the green taxonomy. And it is also interesting to see what can be done for innovation in storage, which could help reduce the cost and then change a bit this kind of results. So I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention here.
Thank you, Milien. As usual, I will see if there is any question, but there is no question. I have more of a comment than a question, I would say. And then I will perhaps also a question. Now, the comment is the following. In the light of improving a bit the narrative of the paper and of the study, it's rather puzzling, assuming that, at least to me, assuming that photovoltaic produce in off-peak hours. The standard definition of off-peak is that, for instance, peak is between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. and off-peak is the other way around. And normally photovoltaic producers during lunchtime or when there is the sun, not at night. So it would be exactly the opposite in terms of terminology. But there is a point, as far as I understand, in the sense that photovoltaic depress the price of electricity, which is low, in a system which already see a lot of photovoltaic implemented. So it's the goose effect, not the duck goose effect. So you have a point in saying that at 6 p.m., for instance, when the sun goes out, it's when more electricity is needed, and it is when photovoltaic goes down, there are huge ramps. So I would urge you to, and I know that that comes from another paper, the one you cite, but I would urge you to use a different reframing in saying that the story holds, the story that photovoltaic produce and therefore lower price when price is low in a system which already sees a lot of photovoltaics. The extreme theoretical case is a case in which in a system with full renewables in place, the electricity price of renewables will be zero. That's the extreme, of course, but that also is linked with another point which I urge you to investigate further, maybe not in this paper but in a further paper, which is that the price you're talking is the day ahead price, which is just one component of the electricity price, and it's not necessarily the most important one even for storage. The idea of working that you have in mind, that you have presented in the paper, is storage working for arbitrage of prices, of day-ahead prices. But that's just, if you investigate business plans of storage, you soon see that that is just one part of the revenues from storage, and possibly not the highest one. The strongest one, so not just for arbitrage during the day, but the highest one is for arbitrage on forecaster errors, or in general for arbitrage whenever there is need of balancing capacity. That plays a huge part for revenues for storage plants, and I suppose that you have not dealt with balancing, of course, or at least maybe not in this simulation. So the second comment and question is how you plan, if you plan, or how that could be planned to be introduced in future analysis, how balancing is planned to be introduced in future analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very insightful remarks. So just about this last point, so our idea was just to basically says, okay, this is a different branch of the literature that focuses on multiple markets. And in particular, they have shown that, as you said, the balancing markets and the different services provided by storage in the very short term are much more profitable than the arbitrage on the energy only market on day ahead, basically. So this is something that we know and we have in mind. It's just that this type of markets are very limited in size. We are talking about a few gigawatts. And basically, we decided to go for a different approach, saying, okay, we're not looking at the system, at the storage system level or at the firm level, because this is basically what you would do. Different revenue streams would be evaluated using the dynamic programming approaches, something like that, which is not easy to generalize to a market equilibrium approach. And we were like, okay, we're going to go for a medium-term approach between 2050 and between now. So it's around 2030, 2040. And we say that we want to show that the amount of storage at some point will become too high and will saturate this very limited types of market, the balancing ones. And in particular, we have other types of technologies, well, not technologies, but solutions such as load management and demand response and things like that are much more interesting than storage, or at least that could heavily compete with storage. And we were focusing more on a market equilibrium approach. But yeah, your point is right. And we do not necessarily, we will not try to include it probably. And we've got some more industrial results saying that by 2030, the energy-only market will be the main source of revenues for storage. But for now, it is clear that if you are going for storage, it is more interesting to go for balancing markets and other services than just the day-ahead arbitrage. That's for sure.
Thank you for your answer. And of course, you know, when you see a study, especially an interesting study, there's always a tendency to ask for more, but at some point you need to stop it. So it makes completely sense that you don't plan to introduce that in this paper. But at least a comment on this, I think it's needed. Moreover, and this is more in general, not just for your study, but when we think about, you know, 100% renewable system, we need to understand what you mean in electricity. I mean, we need to understand what does the 100% of what is. So if it is, like many people who probably don't know it too well, 100% of the energy consumed in a given period, that means 100% of capacity, because you need to cover the peak, which incidentally, at least in my point of view, doesn't make much sense. That's what dispatching is there for, to show what is best to implement at peak and off peak. So if it is 100% of peak, then we are with the renewable paradox, that we are left in a system in which the price will always be zero and the only value would be balancing. Again, I'm not saying that you should take this into account right now, but it's something that in scenarios analysis for electricity market that think about investments. Investment depend on price, and price depends on the evolution of the system. So it's something that really needs to be discussed in order to have a meaningful, you know, insights. Thank you, and thank you for the discussion. I don't see any other questions, so we are a bit ahead of time, but not much. So I would now give the floor to Diyun Huang, hoping to have pronounced well your name.
Yes, I pronouncing very well. I'm Diyun from University of Leuven.
Yes, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to share screen. Hi, everyone. I'm presenting the paper, Collaborative Governance for the European Cross-Border Network Investments, Building Inclusive Institutions with User Voting Approach. So I first give you some context of why collaborative governance. In the past decade, the European cross-border network planning is organized by NTOE, and it plans and publish updates the TYNDP 10-year network development plan every 2 years. The countries join this TYNDP and they share the same planning methodology and investment process. Well, in the last TYNDP Vision 2022, it uses the nationally binding National Energy and Climate Plan as the basis for central scenario for which the cross-border network projects are assessed, the cost-benefit assessed. However, the project approval decision power today are within national authorities, and the permits are shared between national and local governments. And at the same time, the investment remunerations are also the national at national level. So the potential project developer have to coordinate heterogeneous remuneration policy and approval process and permits across borders. It adds the transaction costs. Then we have also very high uncertainty facing the future generation and load pattern. This creates a situation the regulatory hold off for cross-border network, because as national regulator, you will be more hesitant to approve projects that you're afraid to become stranded asset in the future, especially if part of that asset locate in other judiciary area. One way to address this dilemma is to have a centralized European energy regulator solely responsible for the cross-border network approval and financing. However, it is not here at the moment, and we check on the European legislation system. There is a moronic doctrine that implies there's only limited transfer of discretionary power to EU agency possible. So this centralized European regulator will not be likely in the short term. Adding to the regulatory and political dilemma, the technology landscape is changing, and policy, the climate policy is playing an ever increasingly important role. So in the past decade, decarbonization happens in electricity system and at national level. Next, it's going to be the mobility and heating sector decarbonization. So electricity demand will increase by several folds, although how much and when and how this increase happens is still uncertain. Digitalization will give the ability to aggregate and optimize the generation and storage and demand and device. So it has implication, the combination have implication for the transmission network investments. For example, the flexibility coming from the consumer side with electrical batteries and storage, as the first speaker already showed, because they change the demand pattern. So it can fill the valley or shape the peak. So it can defer transmission investment or even partially replace some transmission expansion. And also now with the virtual power plant with new players and then the prosumers, the contractual relationship between grid and the consumer side is changing. As you see in this figure, we will have now a two-way flow between the grid and the consumer, the prosumer side, which could have implication for transmission investment. For example, the local energy community that may just use the grid as the reliability backup. And so they represent like the aggregators that represent them, or the virtual power plant are likely to negotiate with the grid for more favorable cost allocation schemes for those type of consumers. And so the big wire-centered governance model may face challenge. As we also discussed, the electricity decarbonization happens at national level, but for other sector coupling, such like mobility, the cities and states level government are going to play a much more important role. The mobility used to be integrated with urban planning, so it's the electricity demand associated with it depend to a large extent the local context. For instance, the building density in the cities are higher, so the charging infrastructure installation pattern is different in cities, and also it depends on the kind of incentive scheme the cities give. And just the speaker talked about, the tariff scheme can also change the pattern, or the choice of investing heavily on public transportation can also give another pattern. So considering the role of cities and states in shaping the demand, we advocate to include them also in the energy planning. As we just talked about increasing role of the decentralized energy system, still there is a very important role for the cross-border network in the future that we can see, as it connects the resources over long distance, so it can tap the potential of the complementarity of resources from far away, like the solar in Southern Europe and the wind in Northern Europe. Then the weather pattern correlation is low, and so together it gives a more reliable electricity supply. So we envision the future energy system to be a combination of the centralized and decentralized elements. Then we propose to have the collaborative governance to reconcile the centralized and decentralized energy system elements, and to involve the affected stakeholders to come together and make decisions together to work towards the common economic decarbonization and economic objective. So we find some discussion in literature about collaborative governance, and it features a public and private stakeholder involvement, and very importantly, is direct participation in the decision-making from private actors. So in this research, we propose the use of voting on cross-border network investments as a complementary mechanism to today's administrative approval approach. Then we will have also the decision-making based on consensus. And to achieve this objective, we advocate to add new governance layers to today's decision-making structure, as we just discussed, to involve the cities and states in the planning. And we also propose to create a regional energy committee as user cooperative. This is inspired by the member committee of PJM that advises the PJM board. The member committee consists of 5 sector committee in PJM. They are the main stakeholders that have a major impact on the transmission business and on the PJM market. So we propose to establish a regional energy committee similarly, so the users can find their own sector committee when they need help or they have dispute. Then we are based on what we discussed, we are actually effectively transforming the transmission network investment into a multi-sector and a multi-governance level decision-making process. So for specifically for the cross-border network, now the NECP used as a scenario basis, we need to make some input coming from the cities and state level government to give as specific as possible with their decarbonization objective and timelines. And at the same time, it is crucial to develop the transmission network with orchestrated renewable development. And so here we suggest to have the detailed renewable auction parameters, such as the location, the auction capacity, location timelines to be included in NECP. When it comes to the planning process, first we suggest to have a regional planner to use the scenario input and to identify the system bottleneck and calculate the indicative capacity expansion in the main corridors. So it's very similar to T1DP today. What is different is that at the project level assessment, the cost benefit can be assessed by the users themselves, or they can also delegate that to the Regional Energy Committee. Here, we suggest this user voting approach, which was inspired by an Argentinian public contest method, and right after the industry was privatized. The rationale behind the user voting is it can help to depoliticize the transmission investment, or to make it more independent from the government involvement. And at the same time, the grid users will know better than a centralized planner about their vision towards future energy involvement and their own preference, their own cost-benefit perception. This will mitigate some uncertainties that we just talked about. For the process to function, first, the potential network investor should submit project proposal to the regional planner. Then the regional planner will put the project into the market simulation tool to calculate electric usage of the line by each user, and then he can use that to identify the mostly impacted users. Then this group of users, preferably with a limited number, then are invited to come for a user voting. Then the project that passed certain user voting threshold gets approved. Then afterwards, the planning assumption, the cost allocation agreement, and the project costs are saved in distributed ledger for output-based remuneration. And as we talked about before, there is a regional energy committee that functions as a user cooperative across border. So what this energy committee can do is first provide expertise to help the users to assess projects, or it can also help with energy planning for the city or state government. And secondly, when some users do not have a strong technical capacity, they can delegate the voting power to its sector committee to vote on behalf of them. Or when the kind of project beneficiaries are very fragmented and with such a big number, and then they can also aggregate delegate the voting power to member committee to vote on behalf of them. And this member committee and the energy committee is supposed to be responsible for dispute settling and coordinate the cross-border and national part of the transmission network. after the project goes into operation, then we suggest to put this asset in a joint regulated asset base governed by the users. This is inspired from the Climate Club rules. So there are two design features in such club rule. It's first featured by incentives to join the club with benefits shared by members. Secondly, you need to design some penalty for a non-compliance of rules. The benefits for the countries to use a joint regulated asset base and the regional planning is very obvious, because now they can have gain access to this more interconnected energy system with access to complementary resource and then higher markets competition. And also, it's the users that vote with their preference, and then they can hold the investment commitments too. So it mitigates uncertainties from the regulator perspective. And to make this investment accountable, we suggest also to have the output-based remuneration, in which a penalty tariff is applied for the major mismatch between the planning assumption and realized renewable and grid investments. For example, now we have a small system with country A and country B that follows a cap and floor approach in its renewable auction planning. So country A plans 15 to 18 gigawatts of renewable auction, and country B plans 10 to 12 gigawatts. Then the cross-border network between them is approved by the users, but at the designated time, if the country A only realize 12 gigawatts of its renewable auction capacity, then this country A, the grid users, will have to pay a penalty tariff for the 3 gigawatts that's short of from the planning. Likewise, if it's the transmission investments that's missing and generation investments are in place and in time, then the transmission investor should compensate the generators for the foregone revenues. So we come to the conclusion now. In this research, our central proposal is to have the collaborative governance to reconcile the centralized and decentralized elements in the future energy system. We should add a more local governance, government involvement to energy planning, but also to have a kind of a regional energy committee as user cooperative. The user voting approach is suggested as complementary mechanism to today's administrative approach. It can address the gridlock by the regulatory and political dilemma, and by reviewing the user preference and vote for them with commitment, uncertainties from increasingly decentralized energy landscape can be mitigated. And in the end, we suggest to create cross-border joint regulated asset base governed by the users, and the output-based remuneration should be applied to this joint regulated asset base. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Diyun. Thank you for your presentation. I see that there is no question, and probably have been rather poor chair and with a rather poor time management. We are slightly over the schedule. So if there are no further question or comment, I would thank all the presenters, and I would declare the session closed. Thank you for your presentation. I don't have a specific comment on the presentation itself. So I see that there is no intervention, and therefore thank you all for the participation. Thank you, AIEE, for the organization, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye, everyone.